The sound of chains rattling, the crack of a whip cutting desert air, then deadly silence. Under the merciless Arizona sun, a young woman stood barefoot on the splintered wooden platform, her wrists bound by rust-stained iron shackles. The crowd stared at her like they were appraising livestock at market. The auctioneer grinned, sweat streaming down his thick neck. Even 6 years after the Civil War had supposedly ended such horrors, shadowy debt auctions like this still thrived in hidden barns where desperate souls were sold like old cattle to settle unpaid accounts. "Next one up," the auctioneer called, his voice cutting through the stifling heat. 19 years old. No family, no protector. Been sold twice already for debts. Won't speak much, but she's strong enough for field work. Starting bid is $10. In an era when folks valued strong backs for hard labor, a silent girl like her seemed damaged goods. Too broken by war's aftermath and personal tragedy to fetch more than pocket change. The bidding stayed quiet. A man in the front row spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Not worth 5 cents, someone muttered from the crowd. The girl's name was Rose Catherine Pierce, though nobody in that barn knew it. Her dress hung in sun-faded tatters, dust clinging to her olive skin like a second layer of clothing. Her dark hair stuck to her face with sweat, hiding most of the purple bruise that marked her left cheek. She stared straight ahead at nothing, unmoving as carved stone. She had stopped crying months ago. Tears never changed anything in places like this. Then a voice rang out from the back, calm and deep and steady as bedrock. "I'll pay 50. Every head turned. At the rear of the crowd, a man in a weathered brown duster stood with a handful of crumpled bills clutched in his work-hardened fist. His name was Benjamin Ashford. Ben to those who knew him. 52 years old with gray threading through his dark beard. A man who looked like he hadn't smiled genuinely in a decade. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, his sweaty face splitting into a wider grin. "$50? You certain about that price, mister?" Ben nodded once, his weathered face showing no emotion. The gavel slammed down with finality. "Sold to the gentleman in back." Rose didn't move, didn't even glance in his direction. She learned long ago that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Ben stepped through the dispersing crowd, pulling off his hat as he approached. When he saw her face clearly for the first time, his heart nearly stopped beating. That scar, a small crescent-shaped mark on her wrist. 8 years ago, he had helped bandage that very wound himself. He remembered the frightened little girl hiding behind her father's sturdy leg, asking if the cut would leave a permanent mark. He had told her it wouldn't. He had lied, just as he'd lied about so many things during those dark days. The auctioneer roughly shoved Rose forward. Ben caught her before she could stumble, feeling the fevered heat of her skin through the thin fabric of her dress. She looked up at him for the first time, her eyes green as prairie grass, but hollow as abandoned wells. He whispered her name softly, "Rose." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered deep in those empty eyes, like a half-buried memory from before the war, and its aftermath had stolen everything worth remembering. But she pushed that recognition down, buried it deep. Folks in her situation learned fast not to trust familiar faces from better times. Outside the barn, the wind carried the sound of the gavel echoing again as another soul was sold to settle another debt. Ben counted out his last precious coins, placed them in the auctioneer's greedy palm, and walked away with the girl who represented every failure of his past 8 years. The dirt road stretched endlessly under a sky that seemed determined to bake everything beneath it into dust. Rose walked several paces behind Ben's horse, her bare feet finding their rhythm on the sun-cracked earth. The shackles were gone. Ben had unlocked them the moment they left the auction barn, but she could still feel their weight like phantom chains around her wrists. "No person should wear iron in a free territory," he had muttered, pocketing the key with the kind of anger that spoke of personal experience with injustice. The silence between them stretched like the desert horizon, broken only by the steady clip-clop of hooves and the whisper of wind through sagebrush. Ben rode slowly, careful not to outpace her, stealing occasional glances over his shoulder. Each time he looked back, she was staring at the ground, never at him, her dark hair creating a curtain that hid her expression. They stopped to rest near a massive cottonwood tree, its shade the only relief for miles in any direction. Ben dismounted and tied his horse to a low branch, then pulled a dented canteen from his saddlebag. He approached her carefully, the way a man might approach a wounded animal, with respect for both her pain and her potential to lash out. "Water," he said simply, extending the canteen. Rose hesitated, watching him with the wariness of someone who'd learned that kindness often came with hidden costs. Her green eyes, once bright as spring grass, now held the dull sheen of broken trust. Finally, she reached for the canteen, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed his weathered hand. She took one careful sip, then another before wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. When she looked at him directly for the first time since leaving the auction, her voice cut through the desert air like a blade through silk. "Well," she said quietly, her tone flat as a gravestone, "you paid $50 for me. That's more than most girls fetch at those places." She paused, studying his face with the calculating gaze of someone who'd been forced to read men's intentions for survival. "So go ahead. Do what you bought me for." The words hit Ben like a physical blow. For a long moment, he couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at this young woman who'd just offered herself like a transaction to be completed. The casual way she said it, as if her body was just another piece of merchandise to be used and discarded, made his stomach turn. He knelt slowly, making sure she could see his hands were empty and his movements unthreatening. "Rose," he said softly, "I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you to free you." She let out a bitter laugh, short and sharp as a gunshot. "Free me? You think paying money for a person is freedom?" Her voice rose slightly, the first real emotion she'd shown since he'd seen her on that platform. "You think that makes you different from the others?" Ben didn't answer immediately. There was no quick response that would make his actions sound noble when the fundamental act, purchasing another human being, was anything but. He stood slowly, putting distance between them, giving her space to breathe. "I knew your family," he said finally, his voice rough with 8 years of accumulated guilt. "Your father, Michael Pierce, was a good man. Your mother, Catherine, made the best apple pie in 3 counties. He paused, watching recognition flicker in her eyes. "Your little brother Tommy used to follow me around when I visited, asking about horses and wanting to learn how to throw a lasso." Rose's composed facade cracked slightly. Her hand unconsciously moved to the crescent scar on her wrist, the one he'd helped bandage all those years ago. "Everybody knew the Pierce family before the troubles came," she said, but her voice had lost some of its hard edge. "That doesn't make you special." "No," Ben agreed, "it doesn't, but it makes me responsible." She stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the shade, like a caged animal testing the boundaries of her prison. "Responsible for what? For buying me like a horse? For thinking $50 gives you the right to my gratitude? Responsible for not stopping what happened to them." The words came out heavier than he'd intended, weighted with years of sleepless nights and whiskey-soaked attempts to forget. Responsible for being a coward when they needed someone to stand up and do what was right. Rose turned to face him, her green eyes now blazing with something between fury and pain. "And you think rescuing me makes up for letting them die?" "No," Ben said simply. "Nothing can make up for that. But maybe I can keep you from ending up like them." For a long moment they stood there in the dappled shade, 2 broken people carrying the weight of a tragedy that had shaped both their lives in different ways. The desert wind picked up, rustling through the cottonwood leaves with a sound like whispered secrets. "Tell me what really happened that night," Rose said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me why my family is dead and you're still breathing." Ben looked out across the endless expanse of Arizona territory, where heat waves danced like ghosts across the hardpan. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. "My brother Nathan came to me 8 years ago with a proposition. Said he'd found a way to acquire prime farming land cheap. Families who were struggling after the war, behind on territorial taxes, vulnerable to the right kind of pressure." Ben's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I told him I wanted no part of it. I thought that was enough. But it wasn't. No. Nathan went ahead without me. He and his partners, they called themselves debt collectors, but they were really just land thieves with legal papers. They went to families like yours, offered to help with tax problems, got them to sign documents they couldn't read properly. Rose's breathing had become shallow, her face pale despite the desert heat. And when people figured out they'd been cheated, Nathan made sure they couldn't complain to anyone who mattered. Ben's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Your father tried to fight the seizure in territorial court. Nathan couldn't risk that kind of attention. The silence that followed was deafening. Rose sank down onto a fallen log, her head in her hands. When she finally looked up, tears were streaming down her face, the first tears Ben had seen her shed. You knew, she said, her voice breaking. You knew what your brother was planning, and you did nothing. I didn't know about the killings until after, Ben said, though he knew it sounded like the excuse it was. When I found out what Nathan had done to your family, I rode to your farm. But I was too late. Everything was already burning. Where were you when we needed you? The question came out as a sob. Where was the man who used to bring us peppermint sticks from town? Who taught Tommy how to whittle? Who promised my father you'd always be a friend to the Pierce family? Ben had no answer for that. He'd asked himself the same question every day for 8 years, and the answer was always the same. He'd been a coward. He'd chosen the easy path of looking the other way, and good people had died because of his weakness. After the fire, he continued, his voice hollow, I tried to find you. The neighbors said you'd been taken in by the church in Tucson, but when I got there, they told me you'd run away. I spent 2 years searching every town, every mission, every place I thought you might have gone. I didn't run away, Rose said flatly. The church sold me to pay for my keep, said it was better than letting me starve on the streets. The revelation hit Ben like a gut punch. Rose, I never knew. Course you didn't know. Rich men like you don't know what happens to girls like me when we fall through the cracks. She stood up, wiping her face with the back of her hand. But you know now. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Ben looked at this young woman who'd survived horrors he could barely imagine, who'd been betrayed by institutions that should have protected her, who had every right to hate him for his family's crimes and his own failures. And he realized that his guilt, his need for redemption, was irrelevant. This wasn't about what he needed. It was about what she deserved. What do you want me to do? He asked. Rose was quiet for a long time, staring out at the desert landscape that had been both prison and protection for so many lost souls. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady as bedrock. I want you to take me to your brother Nathan, she said. I want to look him in the eye and tell him what his greed cost my family. And then I want you to help me make sure he never hurts anyone else the way he hurt us. Ben felt something cold settle in his chest. Rose, Nathan's not the same man he was 8 years ago. He's got money now, influence, men who work for him. Going after him would be dangerous. She met his eyes with a look that could have melted steel. I've been sold 3 times, beaten more times than I can count, and treated like livestock by men who thought they owned me. You think I'm afraid of dangerous? In that moment, Ben saw not the broken girl he'd rescued from an auction block, but the woman she'd become through surviving the unsurvivable. And he realized that his idea of saving her had been backwards from the start. She wasn't the one who needed saving. He was. 3 days of hard riding brought them to the edge of Copper Canyon, where the desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with cattle and prosperity. Nathan Ashford's ranch stretched as far as the eye could see, a monument to wealth built on other people's graves. The main house sat on a rise like a crown jewel, its white-painted walls and red tile roof a stark contrast to the modest adobe homes that had once dotted this valley. Rose sat beside Ben on a ridge overlooking the spread, her green eyes taking in every detail of the empire built on her family's blood. How many families did he destroy to build all this? She asked quietly. More than I can count, Ben replied, his voice heavy with shame. After your family, he got bolder. Whole towns sometimes, if the land was valuable enough. They watched as workers moved through the fields below, some tending cattle, others working construction on what looked like a new barn. From this distance, it looked like any other successful ranch operation. But Ben knew the truth about how Nathan had acquired the water rights, the mineral claims, the grazing permits that made such prosperity possible. There, Ben said, pointing to a group of men near the main house. The tall one in the black hat. That's Nathan. Rose studied the figure of the man who'd ordered her family's murder. From here, he looked ordinary, just another rancher going about his business. But she could see the deference in the way the other men approached him, the careful distance they maintained. This was a man who ruled through fear as much as money. "How do we get close to him?" Rose asked. "We don't," Ben said firmly. "Nathan surrounds himself with hired guns now, the kind of men who shoot first and ask questions never. Walking into that ranch would be suicide." Rose was quiet for a long moment, her hands gripping the reins of her horse so tightly her knuckles went white. "So we wait for him to come to town? Hope he gets careless?" "Rose, I know you want justice for your family, but revenge won't bring them back." She turned to look at him, her eyes blazing with controlled fury. "You think this is about revenge? You think I rode all this way just to put a bullet in the man who killed my parents? Isn't it?" "No." Rose's voice was steady as mountainstone. "This is about stopping him from doing it again. About making sure no other little girl grows up the way I did, sold and beaten and treated like property because some rich man decided her family's land was worth more than their lives." The conviction in her voice reminded Ben of her father, Michael Pierce, who'd stood up to corrupt territorial officials, even when it cost him everything. The apple, it seemed, hadn't fallen far from the tree. "Then what do you propose we do?" Ben asked. Rose was quiet for another moment, studying the ranch below with the calculating gaze of someone planning a war. "Nathan built his empire on stolen documents and forged claims, right? Legal papers that prove he murdered and cheated his way to all this?" "That's right. But those documents are locked up tighter than Fort Knox. Nathan's not stupid enough to leave evidence lying around." "Maybe not lying around," Rose said slowly, "but he'd keep them close. A man like that, he'd want to be able to touch his trophies when the mood struck him." Ben felt a chill of understanding. "You're talking about breaking into his house." "I'm talking about getting back what he stole. Not just from my family, but from everyone." Rose's voice grew stronger as her plan took shape. "Those documents are proof of his crimes. In the right hands, they could bring down his entire operation. And whose hands would those be? The territorial marshal? Nathan owns half the law enforcement in Arizona. The federal marshal? He's got connections in Washington that go all the way to the top. Then we take them to the newspapers, to the churches, to anyone who'll listen." Rose turned to face him fully. "You said you wanted to make up for being a coward 8 years ago. This is your chance." Ben stared down at the ranch that represented everything wrong with the post-war West. Wealth built on violence, prosperity purchased with other people's blood. He thought about the families who'd lost everything to Nathan's schemes, the children who'd grown up orphaned and broken like Rose. "It would be incredibly dangerous," he said finally. "Everything worth doing is dangerous. We could both end up dead. Better to die fighting than live as cowards." Rose's voice softened slightly. "Ben, I've been dead inside for 8 years. If I die trying to stop Nathan from hurting others, at least I'll die for something that matters." Before Ben could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. 3 riders were making their way up the ridge toward them, ranch hands by the look of their clothes and weapons. They'd been spotted. "We need to go," Ben said urgently, reaching for his rifle. But Rose was already moving, spurring her horse down the backside of the ridge, away from the approaching men. "Follow me," she called over her shoulder, "and try to keep up." They rode hard through a maze of canyons and dry creek beds, using the broken terrain to lose their pursuers. Rose rode like she'd been born in the saddle, guiding her horse through passages that seemed too narrow for both horse and rider. Ben followed, marveling at her skill and wondering where a farmer's daughter had learned to ride like a Comanche. They finally stopped in a hidden grove where a natural spring created a small oasis of green in the desert landscape. Their horses were lathered with sweat, and both riders were breathing hard from the chase. "How did you learn to ride like that?" Ben asked as they watered their horses. "You pick up skills when your life depends on it," Rose replied curtly. "The man who bought me after the church was a horse trader. Kept me around to break wild mustangs because I was too small for them to see as a threat." She touched a scar on her arm that Ben hadn't noticed before. "Learned to read horses better than people." Horses don't lie about their intentions. They sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree, sharing water from Ben's canteen and strips of jerky from his saddlebags. The adrenaline from their escape was fading, replaced by the sobering reality of what they were planning. Nathan will know we were watching him now, Ben said. He'll double his security, maybe bring in more men. Good, Rose said, surprising him. Let him get nervous. Nervous men make mistakes, or they get more dangerous. Rose pulled something from her pocket, a small leather journal, worn smooth by years of handling. This belonged to my father, she said. He kept records of everyone Nathan cheated, every family that lost their land to his schemes, names, dates, property descriptions, everything. Ben stared at the journal as if it were dynamite with a lit fuse. Rose, if Nathan knew you had that, he'd kill me, yes, just like he killed my father for keeping records. She tucked the journal back into her pocket. But my father was smart. He hid copies of the most important documents, and before he died, he told me where. Where? Rose smiled for the first time since Ben had known her, but it was a cold smile, sharp as a blade. In the one place Nathan would never think to look. The cemetery behind the old mission church where he buried them. The implications hit Ben like a thunderbolt. Michael Pierce had hidden evidence of Nathan's crimes in his own family's graves, gambling that his daughter would survive to retrieve it someday. That's brilliant, Ben breathed, and completely insane. My father always said that sometimes you have to be a little insane to stay sane in an insane world. Rose stood, brushing dust from her clothes. The question is, are you insane enough to help me dig up the dead? Ben looked at this young woman who carried her father's courage and her mother's determination, who'd survived horrors that would have broken most people and still had the strength to fight for others. He thought about the 8 years he'd spent drowning his guilt in whiskey and self-pity while she'd been sold and beaten and treated like property. Rose, he said finally, I've been dead inside for 8 years. If digging up graves is what it takes to stop Nathan and maybe earn a piece of redemption, then hand me a shovel. As the sun began to set over the Arizona desert, two unlikely allies made plans to rob the dead in service of the living. Because sometimes justice required a willingness to get your hands dirty, and sometimes the only way to bury the past was to dig it up first. The cemetery behind the mission church was only 20 miles away. But for both Ben and Rose, it might as well have been a journey to the center of the earth, a descent into darkness that would either destroy them or finally set them free. The old mission church stood like a broken tooth against the star-filled sky, its adobe walls crumbling from decades of neglect and desert wind. Behind it, weathered wooden crosses and simple stone markers dotted the cemetery where the forgotten dead of Arizona territory lay sleeping. Rose knelt beside 3 graves set apart from the others, her fingers tracing the carved names. Michael Pierce, Catherine Pierce, Thomas Pierce. They're really here, she whispered, her voice catching slightly. After all these years of not knowing where they were buried, they're actually here. Ben stood a respectful distance away, holding 2 shovels and a lantern while keeping watch for any sign of approaching riders. The cemetery felt haunted not by spirits, but by the weight of unfinished business and buried secrets. Your father was a smart man, Ben said quietly, hiding evidence with the dead. It's the one place Nathan would never think to look. Rose pulled her father's journal from her pocket and opened it to a page marked with a pressed desert flower. According to this, Papa buried a metal strongbox with copies of all the documents Nathan forced families to sign, plus evidence of the bribes he paid to territorial officials. She looked up at the 3 graves. The question is which one? Ben set down the lantern and handed her a shovel. Your father would have wanted to protect the evidence at all costs. Where would he have felt it was safest? Rose studied the graves, thinking back to what she remembered of her family's dynamics. Her father had been the planner, her mother the heart of the family, and little Tommy. Tommy had been everyone's favorite, the one they all spoiled and protected. Tommy's grave, she said with sudden certainty. Papa would have put it with Tommy because he knew that even if someone suspected the evidence was here, they'd be least likely to disturb a child's resting place. They began to dig in the soft earth beside Tommy's headstone, working by lantern light and speaking in whispers. The work was hard and grim. Digging up a grave felt like violating something sacred, even when it was for the right reasons. "Tell me about them," Ben said as they worked. "Your family. What were they really like?" Rose paused in her digging, leaning on her shovel handle. "Papa was the kind of man who'd give his last dollar to a stranger in need. Mama could make anyone feel welcome at our table, even if we barely had enough food for ourselves." Her voice grew softer. "And Tommy was just pure joy. Everything was an adventure to him. He wanted to be a cowboy when he grew up, said he was going to have the biggest ranch in Arizona, and invite everyone in the territory to come visit. He sounds like he was something special." They all were. That's what makes what Nathan did so evil. He didn't just kill 3 people. He destroyed 3 lights in the world that can never be replaced. They dug into silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The desert night was quiet except for the occasional call of a coyote and the scrape of shovels against earth. When Ben's shovel finally struck something metal with a hollow clang, they both froze. "That's it," Rose breathed. They cleared away the remaining dirt to reveal a small iron strongbox, its surface rusty but intact. Rose lifted it from the grave with reverent hands, feeling the weight of her family's legacy and Nathan's crimes. "We need to open this somewhere safe," Ben said, scanning the darkness around them. Nathan's men could be anywhere. But before they could fill in the grave and leave, the sound of approaching horses shattered the cemetery's peace. Multiple riders, moving fast and coming directly toward them. "Run!" Ben hissed, grabbing the lantern and shovel. Rose clutched the strongbox to her chest and sprinted toward their horses. Ben close behind her. But it was too late. Riders appeared from 3 directions, surrounding them in the cemetery with weapons drawn. "Well, well," a familiar voice called out from the darkness. "If it isn't my dear brother Ben, playing grave robber with his little friend?" Nathan Ashford rode into the circle of light cast by Ben's lantern, his expensive clothes and polished boots marking him as a man who'd prospered while others suffered. He was older than Ben by 2 years, with the same strong jaw but none of the weathered honesty that marked his brother's face. His eyes were cold as winter stars. "Hello, Nathan," Ben said quietly, positioning himself between his brother and Rose. "You always were the dramatic one, Ben. Most folks just knock on the front door when they want to have a conversation." Nathan's gaze shifted to Rose, studying her face with the calculating attention of a man trying to place a half-remembered face. "And who might this lovely young lady be?" Rose stepped out from behind Ben, the strongbox still clutched in her arms. When she spoke, her voice carried across the cemetery like a blade cutting silk. "My name is Rose Catherine Pierce, daughter of Michael and Catherine Pierce, sister to Thomas Pierce, the family your greed murdered 8 years ago." Nathan's confident expression flickered for just a moment. Surprise, then recognition, then something that might have been fear. "Little Rose Pierce. My, how you've grown. Last time I saw you, you were hiding behind your father's leg while he spouted nonsense about legal ownership and property rights. The last time you saw me, I was watching my family's farm burn while you counted the money from selling our land." Nathan's smile was sharp as a knife edge. "Business is business, my dear. Your father chose to fight rather than accept a generous offer for property he couldn't afford to keep anyway. Tragic, really, how these misunderstandings can escalate." Rose's knuckles went white around the strongbox. "Misunderstanding? You had my family murdered for refusing to sign fraudulent documents? I had nothing to do with that unfortunate fire. Your father was a careless man with a lantern, as I recall. These things happen on isolated farms." Ben stepped forward, his hand moving toward his gun. "Enough lies, Nathan. We both know what really happened." "Do we?" Nathan's voice hardened. "What I know is that you're trespassing on church property, desecrating graves, and stealing items that don't belong to you." He gestured to his men who raised their rifles. "The territorial marshal will be very interested to hear about this grave robbing incident." "The territorial marshal works for you," Rose said flatly. "The territorial marshal works for justice and order. 2 concepts you seem to have forgotten." Nathan's eyes fixed on the strongbox. "Now, I'll ask once nicely. Hand over whatever you dug up from that grave, and perhaps this unfortunate situation can be resolved without bloodshed." Rose looked around at the armed men surrounding them, calculating odds and options. They were outnumbered 6-1, trapped in an open cemetery with nowhere to run. The smart thing would be to surrender the evidence and hope Nathan would let them live. Instead, she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She opened the strongbox right there in front of Nathan and his men, pulling out a thick bundle of documents and holding them up in the lantern light. "You want these papers?" she called out, her voice carrying across the cemetery. "The same papers that prove you murdered the Hendersons for their water rights? The Morettis for their mineral claims? The Johnsons for their grazing land?" Nathan's face went pale. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about." Rose's voice grew stronger. "Signed confessions from the men you paid to burn us out. Copies of the forged documents you used to steal our land. Bank records showing payments to corrupt territorial officials." She held the papers higher, and Ben suddenly understood what she was planning. "Rose, no!" But she was already moving, striking a match and holding it close to the bundle of documents. "You want to see these papers disappear, Nathan? Fine. But they're going to disappear in a way that makes sure everyone knows what you really are." "Stop!" Nathan shouted, spurring his horse forward. "Those documents are worthless forgeries anyway." "Then you won't mind if I burn them," Rose said calmly, the flame creeping closer to the papers. Nathan's desperate lunge to stop her told everyone present exactly how worthless those documents really were. And in that moment of chaos, with Nathan's horse rearing and his men confused about whether to shoot or try to save the evidence, Ben made his move. His first shot took down the nearest rider. His second sent another man tumbling from his saddle. In the confusion that followed, Rose tucked the real documents inside her dress and set fire to a bundle of blank papers from the bottom of the strongbox. "The evidence!" Nathan screamed, watching what he thought was his exposure burning in the dirt. "Save the evidence!" But by the time his men realized they'd been fooled, Ben and Rose were already mounted and riding hard into the desert night, carrying with them the means to destroy Nathan Ashford's empire and finally bring justice to the families he destroyed. Behind them, the cemetery fell silent again, except for the crackling of burning paper and Nathan's furious curses echoing across the graves of the innocent dead. They rode through the night like demons were chasing them, which wasn't far from the truth. The desert landscape blurred past in shades of silver and black under the star-filled sky, and behind them, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew steadily closer. Nathan's men were pushing their horses hard, driven by their boss's fury and the knowledge that failure would mean more than just lost wages. "There!" Rose pointed toward a cluster of lights in the distance. "Prescott. If we can reach the federal marshal's office." "Nathan owns half the law in this territory," Ben called back, his horse laboring beneath him. "How do we know the federal marshal isn't in his pocket too?" "Because my father researched everyone before he started keeping those records. Marshal James Crawford is the only lawman in Arizona territory that Nathan couldn't buy." Rose clutched the real documents against her chest, feeling them crinkle under her shirt. "Papa planned for this day, Ben. He knew someone would eventually come for these papers." They thundered into Prescott just as the eastern sky began to show the first hints of dawn, their horses foam-flecked and exhausted. The federal marshal's office was a squat adobe building near the center of town, with a hand-painted sign and bars on the windows. A light burned in the window, despite the early hour. Ben and Rose burst through the door to find a tall, lean man in his 50s cleaning a rifle at his desk. Marshal Crawford looked up at their dramatic entrance with the calm expression of someone who'd seen every kind of trouble the frontier could produce. "Let me guess," Crawford said dryly, setting down his cleaning cloth. "You're being chased by armed men, you've got evidence of serious crimes, and you need federal protection." He gestured to chairs in front of his desk. "It's Tuesday." "Must be Tuesday." "Marshal Crawford," Rose said breathlessly, pulling the documents from inside her shirt. "My name is Rose Pierce, and these papers prove that Nathan Ashford has been murdering families and stealing their land for the past 8 years. Crawford's eyebrows rose slightly. "Bold claim, miss. You have documentation to support it?" Rose spread the papers across his desk. Signed confessions, forged land deeds, bank records showing bribes to territorial officials, and a detailed list of families who'd been cheated or killed. Crawford studied each document carefully, his expression growing grimmer with every page. "Sweet Jesus," he murmured, holding up a confession signed by one of Nathan's hired guns. "This man admits to burning out the Henderson family in their sleep. Says Nathan paid him $50 for each body." "There's more," Rose said, pulling out a thick ledger. "Nathan kept records of every bribe he paid, every official he corrupted, every family he destroyed. He was so proud of his success that he documented it all." Ben leaned forward. "Marshal, Nathan's men are probably less than an hour behind us. If you're going to arrest him, it needs to be now, before he can destroy more evidence or disappear." Crawford stood, reaching for his hat and gun belt. "Miss Pierce, these documents appear genuine, and if they are, Nathan Ashford is looking at federal charges for murder, conspiracy, fraud, and about 6 other felonies." He paused at the door. "But I have to ask, how did you come by these papers?" Rose exchanged a look with Ben. "We dug them up from my family's graves, where my father hid them before Nathan had him killed." "Grave robbing's a crime too," Crawford pointed out. "So is genocide," Rose replied flatly. "I think stopping a mass murderer trumps disturbing a few bones." Crawford considered this, then nodded. "Fair point. Let's go collect Mr. Ashford." They rode out with Crawford and 6 federal deputies, a small army heading toward Nathan's ranch in the growing morning light. But as they crested the hill overlooking the spread, they saw that Nathan had anticipated this move. The ranch was deserted except for a few confused-looking cowboys who clearly had no idea what their boss had been up to. "He's run," Crawford said grimly, "probably headed for Mexico or California, somewhere beyond federal jurisdiction." "No," Rose said, studying the empty ranch with the calculating gaze she'd developed over years of reading dangerous situations. "Nathan's too proud to run. He thinks he's untouchable, that his money and connections can get him out of anything." She pointed toward the main house. "He's in there, probably burning evidence and planning his legal defense." Crawford deployed his men around the house while he, Ben, and Rose approached the front door. The marshal knocked loudly, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "Nathan Ashford, this is Marshal Crawford with the United States Marshal Service. Open the door and come out with your hands visible." The door opened to reveal Nathan himself, dressed in an expensive suit and looking remarkably calm for a man whose empire was crumbling around him. "Marshal Crawford," he said pleasantly, "what brings federal law enforcement to my humble ranch?" "You're under arrest for multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, fraud, and corruption of territorial officials." Crawford held up an arrest warrant. "We have evidence, signed confessions, and witnesses." Nathan's smile never wavered. "I think you'll find that evidence was obtained illegally through grave robbing and trespassing. No federal judge will accept testimony from criminals." "Maybe not," Rose said, stepping forward, "but they'll accept testimony from this." She pulled a small metal cylinder from her pocket, the kind used to protect important documents during transport. "Before my father hid the documents in the cemetery, he sent copies to newspapers in Denver, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C., with instructions to publish them if anything happened to our family." Nathan's composed facade finally cracked. "That's impossible. If such evidence existed, it would have surfaced years ago." "The letters were to be held for 10 years, then opened and published," Rose continued. "My father figured that would give me time to grow up and claim them if I survived. Those 10 years are up next month." It was a lie, but a convincing one. Nathan's face went white as he calculated the implications of his crimes being splashed across front pages from coast to coast. "Even if that were true," and Nathan said desperately, "I have friends in high places, people who owe me favors." "Had friends," Crawford corrected. "Past tense. Amazing how quickly people forget your name when federal marshals come asking questions." He gestured to his deputies. "Take him into custody." As the handcuffs clicked around Nathan's wrists, he looked directly at Rose with something between hatred and grudging respect. "You're just like your father," he said, "too stubborn to know when you're beaten." "The difference is, I lived long enough to beat you back," Rose replied. They loaded Nathan into a prison wagon for transport to the federal courthouse in Phoenix, where he would await trial on charges that could see him hanged. As the wagon rolled away, Ben and Rose stood together in the ranch yard, watching 8 years of injustice finally face the scales of justice. "It's over," Ben said quietly. "This part is," Rose agreed. "But there are other Nathan Ashfords out there. Other families being destroyed by men who think money makes them untouchable." Ben looked at her, this young woman who'd survived horrors that would have broken most people and still had the strength to fight for others. "What will you do now?" Rose gazed out across the ranch that would soon be seized by federal authorities and sold to pay restitution to Nathan's victims. "Marshall Crawford offered me a job as a territorial investigator. Seems the government needs people who understand how land fraud works and aren't afraid to get their hands dirty stopping it." "And?" "I said yes." Rose turned to face him fully. "Ben, you spent 8 years drowning in guilt over what your brother did. But guilt without action is just self-pity. If you really want to make amends for the past, help me make sure it doesn't happen again." Ben considered the offer, trading his quiet, guilt-ridden existence for a life spent fighting the kind of corruption that had destroyed so many innocent families. It would be dangerous work, the kind that made enemies of powerful men and put targets on the backs of anyone brave enough to pursue it. But as he looked at Rose's determined face and thought about all the families who might be saved by their efforts, the choice became clear. "When do we start?" he asked. Rose smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her since the day he'd bought her freedom at that terrible auction. "We start by making sure Nathan Ashford's trial becomes a lesson that echoes across every territory in the West, that no amount of money or influence can protect you when you prey on innocent families." As they walked toward their horses, Ben realized something that had taken him 8 years to understand. Redemption wasn't about feeling better about past failures. It was about using those failures to prevent future ones. And for the first time since the night the Pierce family died, Benjamin Ashford felt like he might actually deserve to be alive. The federal courthouse in Phoenix buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that came before historic trials. Word had spread across Arizona territory that Nathan Ashford, the man who'd built an empire on stolen land and murdered families, was finally going to face justice. The courtroom was packed with survivors of his schemes, territorial officials trying to distance themselves from his corruption, and newspaper reporters who'd traveled from as far away as San Francisco to cover the trial. Rose sat in the front row, wearing the first new dress she'd owned in 8 years. Simple blue cotton that Marshall Crawford had insisted the federal government purchase for her testimony. Beside her, Ben nervously adjusted his tie, uncomfortable in the formal clothes required for federal court. "You don't have to do this," Ben whispered as they waited for the proceedings to begin. "Your testimony alone is enough to convict him." "Yes, I do," Rose replied, her green eyes fixed on the defendant's table, where Nathan sat with 3 expensive lawyers. "Every family he destroyed deserves to have their story told in open court. The Hendersons, the Morettis, the Johnsons, they can't speak for themselves anymore." Nathan looked remarkably composed for a man facing the gallows, his expensive suit and carefully groomed appearance designed to project innocence and respectability. His legal team had spent weeks trying to get the evidence thrown out on technicalities, claiming the documents were forged and the confessions coerced. Federal Judge Harrison Carter called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. Carter was known throughout the territory as a man who couldn't be bought or intimidated, one of the few judges Nathan's money had never been able to reach. "The United States of America versus Nathan Ashford," Judge Carter announced. "Mr. Ashford, you stand accused of multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, fraud, bribery of territorial officials, and violations of federal land ownership laws. How do you plead?" Nathan stood, his voice carrying clearly across the packed courtroom. "Not guilty on all counts, Your Honor. These charges are based on forged documents and the testimony of criminals seeking to profit from false accusations. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Federal prosecutor William Hayes presented document after document proving Nathan's crimes. Forged land deeds, bank records showing bribes, and signed confessions from the men Nathan had hired to do his killing. When Rose was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. She walked to the witness stand with steady steps, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. As she began to speak, her voice carried clearly to every corner of the room. My name is Rose Catherine Pierce. 8 years ago, Nathan Ashford ordered the murder of my entire family to steal our land. Nathan's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Edmund Blackwood, immediately objected. Your Honor, the witness is making inflammatory accusations without foundation. Overruled, Judge Carter said firmly. The witness may tell her story. Rose continued, describing the night her family died, the years of being sold from owner to owner, and the systematic way Nathan had destroyed dozens of families across the territory. Her testimony was calm and factual, but the impact on the courtroom was electric. Several people in the gallery were openly weeping. When Blackwood cross-examined her, he tried every trick in the book to discredit her testimony. Miss Pierce, isn't it true that you were purchased at an illegal auction by Mr. Benjamin Ashford, the defendant's brother? Yes. And isn't it true that you and Mr. Ashford conspired to frame my client using forged documents? Rose met Blackwood's gaze steadily. Mr. Blackwood, I was sold at that auction because men like your client think human beings can be bought and owned like livestock. The documents we recovered are real, and they prove your client is a murderer. Your Honor, I object. Sustained, Judge Carter said. The witness will stick to facts, not characterizations. But the damage was done. Rose's quiet dignity and unshakable composure made it clear to everyone in the courtroom that she was telling the truth. Ben's testimony was equally powerful. He described his brother's recruitment of him for the land fraud scheme, his own cowardice in failing to stop it, and the evidence he'd helped recover from the Pierce family graves. Mr. Ashford, Prosecutor Hayes said during Ben's testimony, you're essentially confessing to being an accessory to your brother's crimes. Why should this court believe anything you say? Because I've spent 8 years living with the guilt of my silence, Ben replied. Because I watched good families die while I did nothing. And because I'm the only person left alive who can testify to Nathan's direct involvement in planning these murders. The most devastating testimony came from Marcus Webb, one of Nathan's former hired guns who'd been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation. Webb was a hard man with scars on his face and hands, but his voice shook as he described the families he'd killed on Nathan's orders. He paid us $50 for each adult, $25 for each child, Webb testified, said it was cheaper than fighting them in court, and dead folks don't appeal territorial judges' decisions. Blackwood tried to discredit Webb as a confessed killer seeking to reduce his own sentence, but the man's detailed knowledge of Nathan's operations was impossible to fake. The defense's case was weak and desperate. Nathan took the stand in his own defense, painting himself as a legitimate businessman who'd been framed by his bitter brother and a disturbed young woman seeking revenge for her family's accidental death. I never ordered anyone's death, Nathan swore under oath. The documents the prosecution claims are mine are obvious forgeries. My brother Benjamin has harbored resentment against me for years over business disagreements. But when Prosecutor Hayes cross-examined him, Nathan's composure began to crack. Mr. Ashford, if these documents are forgeries, how do you explain the fact that they contain details about your business operations that only you would know? I don't know how they obtained that information. How do you explain the testimony of multiple witnesses who heard you give orders to kill the families who refused to sell? They're lying to save themselves. How do you explain the fact that you became wealthy immediately after each family's death, purchasing their land for a fraction of its value? Nathan's face flushed red. I was a successful businessman who recognized opportunities when they arose. Opportunities created by murder and arson? Objection, Blackwood shouted. Sustained, Judge Carter said, but the point had been made. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but the verdict was never really in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony credible, and Nathan's own arrogance had prevented him from mounting an effective defense. When the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of fraud. The list went on for nearly 10 minutes, guilty on all counts. Judge Carter scheduled sentencing for the following week, but everyone knew what the sentence would be. Nathan Ashford would hang for his crimes, and his empire would be liquidated to pay restitution to his victims' families. As the courtroom emptied, Rose and Ben stood together in the hallway, watching Nathan being led away in shackles. For the first time since her family's death, Rose felt something approaching peace. "It's really over," she said quietly. "This part is," Ben agreed. "But you were right. There are other Nathan Ashfords out there. Other families who need someone willing to fight for them." Rose looked at Ben, this man who'd spent 8 years drowning in guilt, but had finally found the courage to act. "Marshall Crawford officially offered us both positions as federal investigators. We'd work together, tracking down land fraud and corruption across the Western Territories." "Partners? Partners." Rose held out her hand. "Benjamin Ashford, would you like to spend the rest of your life making sure men like your brother never destroy another family?" Ben shook her hand, feeling the strength in her grip and the determination in her green eyes. "Rose Pierce, I can't think of anything I'd rather do." As they walked out of the courthouse together, neither noticed Nathan's lawyer, Edmund Blackwood, watching them from the shadows. Nathan might be finished, but his network of corrupt officials and hired killers was still intact. And there were men with money and power who had reasons to make sure Rose Pierce and Benjamin Ashford never got the chance to expose more uncomfortable truths. The fight for justice had been won, but the war was just beginning. 6 months after Nathan Ashford's execution, Rose stood on the porch of the small cabin she and Ben had built, overlooking a valley where wildflowers bloomed, where blood had once been spilled. The federal government had granted them homestead rights to a section of land that had been seized from Nathan's estate, and they'd used it to establish a base of operations for their new work as territorial investigators. The cabin was modest but solid, built with honest labor and materials paid for with honest money. Behind it stood a barn where they kept their horses and the printing press they'd acquired to publish a small newspaper dedicated to exposing corruption and land fraud throughout the Arizona Territory. Ben emerged from the barn wiping his hands on a rag, his weathered face showing the kind of contentment that came from meaningful work. "The new issue is ready for distribution," he said, holding up a stack of newspapers with the headline, "Territorial Governor Implicated in Mining Fraud Scheme." Rose took one of the papers and scanned the article they'd spent weeks investigating and writing. "Marshall Crawford thinks this might finally be enough to get Governor Williams recalled to Washington for questioning. About time. That man's been stealing from territorial miners for 3 years." Ben set the papers down and moved to stand beside her on the porch, looking out over the valley where they'd built their new life. "Sometimes I can't believe this is real, that we went from that auction barn to this." Rose followed his gaze across the peaceful landscape, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up your quiet ranch life to become a target for every corrupt official in the territory?" Ben considered the question seriously. "I regret the 8 years I wasted feeling sorry for myself while good people suffered. I regret not acting sooner. But this," he gestured toward the cabin, the printing press, the stack of newspapers that would expose another criminal. "This feels like the first honest work I've done since before the war." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Rose automatically reached for the rifle that was never far from her side. Their investigations had made them enemies among powerful men who preferred their crimes to stay hidden. But as the riders came into view, she relaxed. It was Marshall Crawford and 2 other federal agents. "Morning, Marshall," Ben called out as the lawmen dismounted. "What brings you out our way?" Crawford's expression was grim as he approached the porch. "We've got a situation developing in New Mexico territory. A man named Colonel Marcus Vance has been systematically driving Hispanic families off their land grants, claiming their property deeds are invalid under American law." Rose felt her blood run cold. It was the same pattern Nathan had used: legal technicalities to steal land from people who couldn't fight back in American courts. "How many families?" "At least 40 that we know of, maybe more." Crawford handed her a thick folder. "Vance has connections in Washington, territorial judges on his payroll, and a private army of hired guns to enforce his will. The local authorities are either bought or too intimidated to act." Ben studied the documents Crawford had brought, his jaw tightening as he read the details. "This is bigger than anything Nathan ever attempted. Vance is trying to steal an entire valley, which is why we need our best investigators on the case. Crawford looked directly at Rose. These families have been asking specifically for you. Word has spread about the woman who brought down Nathan Ashford. They think you might be the only person willing to fight for them. Rose felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. In the months since Nathan's trial, she and Ben had exposed corruption in territorial governments across 3 states, always working for families who had nowhere else to turn. But this case felt different, bigger and more dangerous than anything they'd tackled before. What kind of timeline are we looking at? She asked. Vance is planning to finalize his land seizures within the next month. After that, the families will have no legal recourse. Crawford's expression grew even grimmer. And Rose, there's something else you should know. Vance has put a bounty on your head. $500 to anyone who brings him proof that you're dead. Ben stepped protectively closer to Rose. Then we don't go. It's too dangerous. Rose looked at the photograph Crawford had included in the folder. A Hispanic family standing in front of their adobe home. Children playing in the yard. Grandparents sitting in the shade. It could have been any family, anywhere in the West, trying to build a life on land they'd owned for generations. Ben, she said quietly, remember what you told me that first day? That you didn't buy me to own me? You bought me to free me? Of course. Well, I wasn't the only one who got freed that day. You freed yourself from 8 years of guilt and cowardice. Rose met his eyes. These families in New Mexico, they're trapped the same way I was trapped on that auction platform. The same way your guilt trapped you. The question is, are we going to walk away when people need us? Ben stared at her for a long moment, seeing in her green eyes the same determination that had driven her to dig up her family's graves and face down Nathan's guns. He thought about the man he'd been before meeting her. Broken, guilt-ridden, useless to anyone including himself. Then he thought about the man he'd become, someone who fought for justice, who protected the innocent, who had found purpose in making amends for past failures. When do we leave? He asked. Crawford smiled for the first time since arriving. I was hoping you'd say that. The Territorial Express leaves for Santa Fe tomorrow morning. That evening, as they packed their few belongings and prepared for another dangerous mission, Rose and Ben sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the valley they'd learned to call home. Ben, Rose said softly, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said months ago. He turned to look at her, noting the unusually nervous expression on her face. In all their months working together, he'd never seen her hesitate to speak her mind about anything. That day at the auction, when you bought me, I was ready to die. Not just physically, but inside. I'd given up hope that life could be anything but pain and exploitation. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But you didn't just buy my freedom. You gave me back my purpose, my strength, my belief that good people still existed in the world. Rose, let me finish. She held up a hand. What I'm trying to say is that somewhere along the way, this partnership became something more for me. Somewhere between digging up graves and exposing corrupt officials, I started falling in love with the man who had the courage to change his life. Ben felt his heart stop, then start again with a rhythm that seemed to echo her words. Are you saying? I'm saying that Benjamin Ashford, if you'll have me, I'd like to be more than just your investigating partner. Rose's voice grew stronger. I'd like to be your wife. The proposal hung in the evening air between them, surprising them both. Rose had never imagined herself as the kind of woman who would propose to a man, but then again, she'd never imagined herself as the kind of woman who would dig up graves or testify in federal court either. Ben was quiet for so long that Rose began to worry she'd misread the growing closeness between them. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object that caught the last light of the setting sun. It was a ring, simple silver with a small turquoise stone, the kind of jewelry that could be made by any competent craftsman, but held infinite value when given with love. I bought this in Phoenix after the trial, Ben said, his voice rough with emotion. I've been carrying it around for 3 months, trying to find the courage to ask you the same question. Rose stared at the ring, then at Ben's weathered face, seeing in his eyes the same love and determination that had driven him to fight for justice despite the dangers. "Is that a yes?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Ben slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms for a kiss that tasted of desert wind and second chances. When they finally broke apart, both were laughing and crying at the same time. "So," Ben said, holding her close, "should we get married before we leave for New Mexico? Or after we finish exposing Colonel Vance?" "Before," Rose said without hesitation. "If we're going to face down another corrupt land grabber, I want to do it as your wife." They were married the next morning in the small chapel in Prescott, with Marshall Crawford serving as witness and the local minister performing a ceremony that was simple but heartfelt. Rose wore the blue dress from Nathan's trial, and Ben wore his best suit, the same one he'd worn to testify against his brother. As they exchanged vows, Rose thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She'd started as merchandise on an auction block, broken and hopeless. Ben had started as a guilt-ridden hermit, hiding from the consequences of his family's crimes. But together, they'd found something neither had thought possible. Love built on shared purpose. Partnership forged in the fires of justice. After the ceremony, they boarded the Territorial Express for Santa Fe, ready to face whatever dangers awaited them in New Mexico. But they faced them together now, as husband and wife, as partners in every sense of the word. As the train pulled away from the station, Rose leaned against Ben's shoulder and watched the Arizona landscape scroll past the window. Somewhere ahead lay another fight for justice, another chance to protect families from the greed of powerful men. "Any regrets?" Ben asked, echoing her question from that morning on their porch. Rose looked down at the silver ring on her finger, then at the man who'd bought her freedom and ended up giving her his heart. "Only one," she said. "What's that?" "I regret that it took us so long to find each other," she smiled, "but I suppose some things are worth waiting for." The train carried them south toward New Mexico territory, toward new dangers and new opportunities to fight for what was right. And if there were men ahead who thought they could intimidate or buy or kill their way out of justice, they were about to learn what happened when they faced two people who'd already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. The auction platform where their story began was hundreds of miles behind them now. Ahead lay only the future they would build together, one act of courage at a time. And that, friends, is how Rose Catherine Pierce learned that sometimes the most powerful words you can speak aren't demands or threats, but a simple statement of truth that cuts through lies like a blade through silk. When she looked Benjamin Ashford in the eye and said, "You paid for me, now do it," she wasn't just challenging him to claim what he'd purchased. She was daring him to prove that not all men who buy women are the same, that sometimes even transactions born in darkness can lead to something resembling light. But here's what makes this story different from all the others. Rose didn't wait to be saved. She didn't cower or hope or pray for rescue. She looked at the man who'd bought her freedom and demanded that he prove himself worthy of the sacrifice she was prepared to make. Because that's what real strength looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face that fear head on and demand that the world rise to meet your courage. Ben's transformation is just as remarkable. He went from a guilt-ridden hermit hiding from his family's crimes to a man who had the courage to dig up graves, face down corrupt officials, and build a life based on justice rather than regret. But his real transformation wasn't about becoming brave. It was about learning that redemption isn't something you earn through suffering, but something you build through action. Their love story reminds us that the strongest relationships aren't built on passion or convenience, but on shared purpose and mutual respect. Rose and Ben didn't fall in love because they needed each other. They fell in love because they chose to fight for something bigger than themselves and discovered that fighting alongside someone can create bonds stronger than any romance novel ever imagined. Think about the courage it took for Rose to propose to Ben. Here was a woman who'd been bought and sold like livestock, who'd been taught that her value was measured in dollars and her worth determined by men's desires. And yet she found the strength to look at the man she loved and ask him to build a future with her. Not because she needed his protection, but because she wanted his partnership. The real villain in this story isn't just Nathan Ashford, though his crimes were horrific enough. The real villain is a system that allowed such men to prosper, that turned human suffering into profit margins, that treated families like obstacles to be removed rather than people to be protected. Rose and Ben's victory wasn't just about putting one corrupt man in prison, it was about proving that ordinary people could fight back against institutional injustice and win. Maybe that's the lesson we need to carry from their story into our own lives. We live in a world where powerful people still exploit the vulnerable, where corruption still masquerades as business as usual, where good families still lose everything to the greed of those who already have more than they could ever need. The faces and methods change, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. But Rose and Ben's story also proves that we don't have to accept injustice as inevitable. We don't have to shrug our shoulders and tell ourselves that nothing ever changes. We can choose to be the people who dig up uncomfortable truths, who stand up to bullies with badges, who fight for families that have nowhere else to turn. The auction platform where their story began represents everything ugly about a world that reduces human beings to their economic value. But the cabin they built together represents everything beautiful about what we can create when we choose love over fear, action over passivity, justice over comfort. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that broken people can heal and that guilty people can find redemption, don't let that feeling fade away like morning mist in the desert. Think about the Rose Pierces in your own community, the people who've been discarded, exploited, or forgotten by systems that should protect them. Think about the Benjamin Ashfords, the people carrying guilt that could be transformed into action if they just had the courage to try. Hit that like button to show your support for stories that remind us of our better angels. Share this tale with someone who might need to hear about the power of demanding that the world live up to its promises of justice and equality. Subscribe to Wild West Stories and ring that notification bell, because every week we're bringing you tales from the frontier that prove the most important battles aren't always fought with guns. Sometimes they're won with truth, courage, and the revolutionary act of refusing to accept that things have to stay the way they have always been. Leave a comment below and tell us about a time you had to demand justice instead of waiting for it to be freely given. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice matters, that their truth has power, that their courage can change the world. The American frontier was built by people who understood that freedom isn't something you're given. It's something you take, something you fight for, something you build with your own hands and protect with your own strength. Rose and Ben's love story reminds us that the greatest frontier we can explore isn't geographic but moral. The courage to stand up for what's right even when it's dangerous, even when it's difficult, even when the odds seem impossible. Their story also reminds us that redemption is always possible, but it requires action. Ben spent 8 years drowning in guilt over his family's crimes, but it wasn't until he chose to act, to fight for Rose's family's justice, that he found peace. Guilt without action is just self-pity, but guilt transformed into purpose can move mountains. Rose's journey from auction block to federal investigator proves that our worst moments don't have to define us. What defines us is what we choose to do after we survive them. She could have spent her life as a victim, and no one would have blamed her. Instead, she chose to become a warrior for justice, someone who turned her pain into purpose and her suffering into strength. Until our trails cross again, remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is look injustice in the eye and say, enough. Sometimes the world needs you to be the person who refuses to accept that cruelty is just the way things are. Sometimes you have to be willing to pay the price for change, knowing that the cost of inaction is always higher than the cost of courage. This has been Wild West Stories, where every tale proves that the human heart is the wildest frontier of all, and that love, real love, built on respect and shared purpose, can conquer anything the world throws at it. Keep fighting the good fight, friends. The world needs more people like Rose and Ben, people who understand that you paid for freedom means you earned the right to use it.